Welcome to a radical discussion of independence, free will, liberty, and the left-hand path. This is Daimonosophy with your host, Paul Frederick.
Welcome, friends and fellow daemons, to another episode of Daimonosophy. And today, my guest is Mr. Tobias Churton. Tobias is one of Britain's leading scholars of Western Esotericism, a world authority on Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Freemasonry, and Rosicrucianism. Holds a master's degree in Theology from Braesnose College Oxford. He's also a poet, composer, filmmaker, and a long-time television career with the BBC, which I just found out about. So, Tobias, welcome. We're going to talk about some of your books, too. Aleister Crowley in England and Lost Pillars of Enoch, but I think I want to know more about this television stuff first. So welcome, okay. Tobias.
Hello, nice to see. I don't know if I'll be seen by anybody, but if not, thank you for listening.
Oh, you will be seen. You will be seen. Oh, right. And you will be heard. We're going to make sure of that.
I'd have put a suit on.
No, you look great. You look wonderful. You look marvelous. So I just learned, as you were telling me before we got on here, that you're responsible for making one of the popular, or one of the first ever Gnosticism series on BBC. Could you tell us a little bit about that, your involvement with that and
TV career? I was going to be a priest. That was my intention in the church, and they found my approach to religion too difficult to handle, the Church of England. So I decided to put my energy into television as an alternative. So I got involved with religious television in Britain in the early 80s, and my aim was to really revolutionize the whole field from being sort of hymns and very conservative sort of programs to investigating religion. And this culminated in 85, 87 period. It was a long series, but very expensive series called Gnostics, which was a first ever history of Gnosticism in the world. And we went all over the world. We found the guy who found the Nag Hammadi library, the great Gnostic library of Upper Egypt. We interviewed him in Upper Egypt. I came to New York and interviewed Hans Jonas, one of the great masters of Gnostic studies. And it was a terrific series, and it won awards. And the book I wrote to go with the TV series was a bestseller in England. And that was the beginning of my writing career, age 26. And I started at the top, and I think, as Orson Welles said, been working my way down ever since. Anyhow, if you're going to make your name in something very transgressive, like the Gnostic tradition, esoterica, in England anyway, you are kind of punished for it by the establishment. And there's only so much that any establishment will take. And I sort of had the feeling I'd rather fallen foul of some of the forces at work. And I paid a high price for that success. And it took a long time to build up another career almost completely devoted to writing, which was funny because I always wanted to be a writer anyway. And the road to it was very long and difficult, but it gives some little indication of my 45-year, I think it is, career to date. 25 books and umpteen films, and goodness knows how many film scripts. And
wow.
I couldn't possibly, and people often say, "Can you tell me about what you?" I said, "No, it would take all day to tell you about."
Right.
I've been trying to as a one-man band, really, alert the world to the power of spiritual traditions, especially those called esoteric, and to clarify understanding of those traditions, because there's so much rubbish talked to, or trash, as you say in America. There's so much trash talked about these subjects, and there's so many excessive people confuse issues and all that. So my thing is always been to get to the bottom of things, to really find out what the truth about them is, and to relay that as clearly as possible to what I call the intelligent layperson. People not necessarily professionally involved as scholars, but who want to know about things that have been discovered. It's been such a rich period since the Second World War, World War II, of revelation. Everyone has heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Hamadi Library, but the objective investigation of religious consciousness has really been tremendously enhanced in the last 50, 60 years. And I'd say in the last 20, 30 particularly, and then you can actually see on a graph the amount of academic papers that are come out these days on subjects like alchemy, which is the subject of my latest book. Not latest to come out, but the one I'm working on at the moment.
So let's let's pause there for a moment, because I agree with what you're saying in this time period, this post-war time period, even I think even like leading up to World War II, get back to World War I, and kind of around in there, there's like a huge like sort of explosion of like information deviating from these traditions that had really sort of ruled, sort of dominated thinking in the West for just, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And and I'm thinking of things like, like Blavatsky and Crowley, and then Gurdjieff and people like that. And then you even get into like fictional things like H.P. Lovecraft is something I like to think of, like he's had like some kind of like influence on things, and all this stuff is like happening around this similar time period. And even now today, if people find themselves going back looking to that, as well as where they got their resources on. So my question then to you then is, this time period, do you think that there are certain factors? What factors do you think contributed to that? Like social, like political factors, economic factors? Why that explosion of information there now?
Well, I think obviously the technological means of transmitting information terribly important. The very fact that we're Skyping each other, you're in Texas and I'm in the middle of England, is an incredible thing. In terms of the openness to the subject matter, I think 2 world wars have a lot to do with it. European and Western culture after the end of World War II was a bit like a figure who had no clothes left. They'd all blown off in the tumult and the horror and thunder of these pointless wars. And what was left was a greater sense of realism in some people anyway, to looking, is there anything left from the shreds of faith and spiritual awareness left that a bomb can't destroy? This is just my way of responding to a question. I'm not saying this is the answer to your question, because it's too big a question to answer in simple words. But I think that people have been more willing to open their minds to alternative explanations, and there has been a corresponding decline in authoritarian religion in the Western world, more so in Europe and England probably than parts of America. And people have been as ever, as they always have been, if they've had the leisure to search. There's been a great deal more leisure, of course, since the war. People have more leisure more people have more leisure. There was always a class of leisured people. More people have had more leisure to investigate the other verities. and the means of transmission have become more available, and more people can read, for a start. There are far more books available publicly than there used to be to the general public if they want to read. We've had television, which I think has really made far more impact than even cinema did. Cinema was still a spectacle you went to see, like a circus or a theatrical performance. Television has invaded people's minds to a great degree, and those minds are ticking over with so many images and stuff. I'm not saying that the content of the television has been any way beneficial, but it's been a kind of an assault on consciousness. And some people have responded to it with a kind of alacrity and a feeling that this is a great age to start thinking and communicating and being direct. And other people, of course, have reacted to it and said, well, I want to go back, like the Russian Orthodox Church is currently doing in Moscow, which is they hate the Western liberalism, as they call it, sinful. That the whole Western world's gone sort of mad and liberal and crazy, and they know that homosexuals should be executed or locked up or prevented or ashamed, or etc., etc. And all of that has you got all this going on, and certain solitary individuals perhaps are seeking a meaningful spiritual solution to their own existence, and are driven to wonder how humanity has come to this, what for many people is a semi-apocalyptic, i.e. a culture on the verge of a revelation or a disaster state. And of course, a lot of it's just literally the impetus of technology, of communication technology. I'm not sure we have the brains today to deal with this much information. I know that a reaction to a lot of people I know to the current events, which are upsetting us deeply, is to pretend it's not there, it's to switch off. We think we can switch off like this, cancelling people. But even though we're switched off, we know somewhere else is switched on. And there is I do think that the plus side of the information revolution, which has been growing through the 20th and 21st century to an incredible degree, the plus side is there is more information for those who want it. The negative side is it's very difficult for people who are not trained to deal and assess the value of any particular piece of information that comes along. I have tried in my work to make a sober assessment of some new material, which has a bearing on the spiritual nature of man and his place, her place, obviously, in the universe.
So I do have to pause, since we mentioned like 2 world wars, and we're talking about apocalypse and some things like that. What do you think of what's going on right now? I mean, we're having to have this conversation with the Russian Ukrainian conflict going on right now. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, personally, I'm considerably frightened and unnerved. I'm waking up in the middle of the night with a kind of profound pit in my stomach of a kind of vacant horror that such a thing can be going on in reality today. If you don't obviously want my, well, I think, I mean, I wrote some letters to the Times about it, newspaper, but they weren't published.
Right.
So I felt that I feel that the way we have been dealing with these situations is not terribly wise.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those unfortunate situations where a small lack of wisdom can be catastrophic.
Mm-hmm.
It's no good standing up saying so and so is evil, so and so is bad, they have broken the rules, etc. Okay, anyone can see that. What are you going to do about it?
Right.
My parents lived through the Cuba Missile crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And what is little known is, although it was reported at the end of the crisis that the Russians had backed down, that isn't the whole truth. In fact, Russia and America had made a secret more or less secret deal that there would be no American missiles in Turkey. And that was, for the Russians, that was a face-saving device. And on the basis of that, they were prepared to move the missiles out of Cuba. Now, it seems to me that whether you're dealing with, a Khrushchev, whoever it is, or a Putin, if you're going to make a deal, there has to be an exchange, an advantage to both sides. And it seemed to me in the negotiations that have been going on, I heard a great deal about this principle of NATO, that anyone should be able to join it. Well, the principles in these circumstances are frankly they're just paper.
Right.
An alliance is a necessary thing that nations and peoples form when they're under stress. They have to form an alliance. But NATO has become an institution, and therefore it's almost got creed, almost like a church. It has these principles which must not be broken. Well, I would say in a realpolitik situation, there are some principles which you're going to have to trade. The fact that there is evil on this planet will, as far as I can see, will never change. The entire structure, and this goes back to the main thing our conversation should be about, the structure of the cosmos is totally dualistic. There is black, there is white, there is right, there is wrong, there is left, there is right, there is male, there is female, there is any aspect of right down to the micro level, positive, negative forces. You can't have one without the other. If you have a saint, you are going to have a sinner. If you have a great man, you're going to have a pathetic person. This will always be the case. The moment you think you're over this, that you've conquered the problem, the problem re-emerges in a new form. You can put names to this. This is eternally the same, and it operates in every human being at every aspect of nature. You cannot defeat evil.
Yeah.
That is what the whole apocalyptic literature of 2,000 years ago was trying to say was, well, if the entire cosmos is wrapped up by God at some point, it's all wrapped up, then in that destructive process, destructive of matter and cosmos, good will triumph and there'll be a new heaven and a new earth. I mean, this is the promise of Jehovah's Witnesses and the promise of a huge amount of evangelical religion, that God intends to justify his essential goodness by eventually ending it. The trouble is with these believers is they seem to think it's their business to aid the process. And they look at every dangerous circumstance that occurs in the world through the magnifying lens of television and so on. They look at it as yet another example of biblical prophecy. This is a very dangerous road to follow. If you study the apocalyptic literature, which I have in very great depth over many years, this literature was written to combat particular fears at particular times. The other thing people forget about apocalyptic literature is that at the time it was written, which is mostly 2nd, 3rd century BC, and there's a certain amount in the 1st century as well, apocalyptic was actually taken as a positive thing, because it was comforting to know that despite the horrors that were being visited on certain peoples by the Roman Empire, or whatever empire was threatening another free people or semi-free people, that God was in charge and that he would eventually wrap it all up, and the wicked would be sent to hell and the good would be justified. I suspect today that while this might be an attractive view for some people, and quite, for a simple mind, I think quite a good solution, it hasn't happened, has it? This second coming, so-called, hasn't happened. And I think realistically today, we're beginning to understand that the second coming, if it means anything to us thinking people, is when a person wakes up, not necessarily the planet or the cosmos, when a person wakes up and takes a new approach to reality, and which is a much more difficult thing altogether than expecting God to do it all for us. So yeah, I think every participant in this conflict is in some kind of illusion. Everyone
Right.
who's involved with it at some level, and all I can say is thank goodness nobody. I I may have been able to help a certain period of time ago, but I think they've now taken it to a point where I can only hope that the need of survival preaches sense.
Right.
That's
Yeah,
all I can
and
say.
it seems when you talk about that struggle between good and evil and how that like takes place on I mean that exists like on a cosmic level, that exists on a personal level, and it seems like what happens in ordinary humanity, let us say, that when they go out to fight against evil and struggle against the chaos, what happens is they end up becoming like a part of that. They just end up becoming a part of that chaos. They end up having to do the same atrocities in order to, fight it back. And in the end, nothing ever changes. But what is suggested by what I think of as esoteric knowledge, or maybe like these deeper teachings out there, is that the key to this is an internal personal struggle that has to like take place first. And that's the significant thing. That's where there's like such a thing as maybe rather than triumphing over evil, what happens is by the struggling against that, one experiences another sort of path of evolution or initiation, and we start having to use more esoteric sort of terminology to talk about it. And
I
does
think
that?
though I think though the mass of humanity are not at that stage where they can embrace that.
Oh yeah. And so
That
isn't
notion.
that's also an ancient thing too though. And maybe this is now we're getting like into the theme of your book. There was a time when that was like maybe more common, or as you say that there's a blending of what do you say, science and religion, where that was more common. But now we're in a phase of humanity which has been going on for a really long time, where that's the minority, right? Where that's just that body of knowledge, esoteric knowledge, has been small for a long time for some reason.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose you could argue that we're at a high point of materialism.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much maybe in what people's personal beliefs are, but our culture anyway is entirely based on acquisition, property, possessions, and but more fundamentally than that, which is all rather understandable, way people seek their security, is that our concept of the reality is materialistic. We think it's all basically matter. Now, whether this matter is mysterious subatomic powers or whatever, we're basically thinking it's sort of material. It's all stuff that can be analyzed and measured, and we're made of this stuff, and that's pretty well all it is. And there isn't a dimension which is independent of space and time. Whereas the Gnostic tradition, which I've been investigating for so long, suggests very strongly that there is a dimension which is independent of space, and not entirely independent of space and time, analogous in a way to space and time. And if this is the way forward for science and humanity, then I want to promote it, because we can see around us the results of materialism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, materialism is what appeals to the first stage of childhood. You know, my mouth is open, I want to be fed.
Mm-hmm.
And it should be that as people grow older and more mature, that other sensibilities come to the fore, and they realize that, as Jesus said, man cannot live on bread alone.
Mm-hmm.
And that we need, in fact, spiritual sustenance, because all that is of this world inevitably perishes.
Mm.
Why some people want to hasten that process, I do not know, because there's so much to be learned from living in this world as it is, and it's a beautiful experience at the best of it. Why are there always people trying to spoil that? I don't. I've never really understood that. We can talk about dualism, but you see it in families. You get one person who's positive-minded and tries to do good, and the other one ends up in a criminal penitentiary. And you can't
Mm-hmm.
really. They had the same upbringing, but they went different ways. And
Mm-hmm.
it's life's full of these tragedies. So it's the truth and the answer to all these problems have always been there, but people aren't always in the right place to see it.
Right.
Sometimes it comes to people after a shock, or a shock of reality. I'm sure there are people who are going to wake up hopefully after this current crisis, and that's going to actually make them see that there are certain more important things than what they were obsessed with before.
Yeah.
Um, and that is what we were talking about before. I think after World War II, you had this new generation of people. There was a kind of flowering in the 1960s of a rather slightly lost generation, but they had their own pointers. They had their own poets. They had their own singers. They had their own music there, and of course, the culture of the 60s was a youth culture. Which embraced a lot of people, had great diversity in it, and it was a tremendously positive force. It's been tragic to see the decline of youth culture. I think this process began more or less in the 80s, I suppose, when vast numbers of young people decided that, I want to be a material girl, or I'm going to wear red braces and be a stockbroker, and that's the way forward. And, the bonfire of the vanities and all that. But it hasn't led anywhere. I think the 80s glam and all that. I was in New York in the 80s. I was watching it, and I watched a lot of lost young men,
Uh-huh.
particularly in New York, Manhattan. I watched them. When you asked them questions about what they were doing, there was a great insecurity underneath it, underneath the bravado and the
Uh-huh.
chewing gum on Wall Street. Underneath that was a spiritual emptiness, which
Yeah.
they were being encouraged not to look at. Well, I think we're
Right.
face to face now with that
Right.
spiritual emptiness.
No, there was a big that there um so someone once commented to me that was like the 80s is probably the bleakest time in America to become interested in any sort of spirituality other than
that's why that's
fundamental
why I
Christianity.
came over. It was amazing. We had an actor, wonderful actor, Nigel Harrison, dressed up as the Gnostic Jesus, walking down the streets of Manhattan. Literally, no one knew there was a camera 200 yards behind, in the costume based on a William Blake painting of the risen Jesus, with
Uh-huh.
blonde curly hair, which is based on the first ever image of the Savior in Roman iconography, spouting down the street the Gnostic Gospels. It was quite incredible, and that was right absolutely at the height of Reaganomics.
Uh-huh.
1986, we filmed that, and we also took him to Sheep's Meadow in Central Park West, and it was really an amazing thing to do, because I knew, and I was young and ready to do it. I knew I was planting something so antithetical to the culture as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
It was almost like a magical act to put him there and say this stuff, and it was remarkable. Yeah, of course you were aware. You were aware of the buoyancy of
Uh-huh.
the Reaganomic era,
Yeah.
and, and I totally understand people who found it a turn on, you know.
Uh-huh.
But it was quite plain to me that it was going to end in a vacuum.
Right. Yeah, as all great parties must come to an end, as they say. So let me ask you. Let's go back and let's go back to prior to the 80s a little bit. So Lost Pillars of Enoch, like this book, like takes up a timeline that's like very like early on, and this idea of these two pillars of Enoch that are a survival of knowledge like from a antediluvian, from a
Flood.
flood,
Yeah.
last apocalypse, if you were, survival of knowledge from like an even much older world that is just beyond all of our current knowledge. Can you talk a little bit about what the quality